Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lore Lords. This is episode 10. I titled it, They Shall Not Pass. I know, it's already been 10 weeks of Lore Lords.
I know, and it's been 10 consistent weeks of Lore Lords.
10 consistent weeks. Haven't missed a beat. Don't count on that forever. Also, I noticed Tommy's not here.
No, he gave me a call earlier. I missed it. I was at work, but I don't think he wants me to play it, but I'm gonna play it for you guys anyway.
Hey, Pat. Yeah, it's Tommy. Look, I need to take at least a week off. Okay, that National Parks episode really fucked me up, and I'm really mad at Atlas, so I don't really want to see him for. I need to cool down. So I'll see you guys next week. Okay, and I swear to fuck, you better do Squid Game soon.
We're not going to do Squid. He's going to be even madder when we end up never doing Squid Games.
We're not going to do Squid Games.
There's just not enough. Just watch the show.
I know.
Just go watch Squid Games.
Yeah,
Tommy, Tommy, if you're listening to this, just watch it again.
Yeah, I don't even know if he did. He did watch it, right?
Did he? Did he not? Maybe he wants us to tell him about it.
Like he's scared to watch it? I don't know.
Maybe. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we are talking about. We're talking about a World War story. We're going into it's going to be very deep, about a specific battle. Probably my favorite. Favorite's a weird word to say about it, but it's just something I think is very interesting. Something that changed the way the war, and honestly wars from that point on, would go forever. And if you don't know, if you know a lot about World War history, you probably already know what it is by the title. If you don't, we're going to get into it now. Let's just go ahead and start.
Yeah.
So, in the history of all warfare, there's one battle that I've always really liked looking into and watching documentaries about, reading about. And it's not only probably the most horrific battle to ever take place in probably human history, but also it never needed to happen, which is probably the most fucked up part of the whole story. Is it's kind of just pointless. And so to start off, let's set a scene in your mind. Close your eyes and go back to the beginning of 1916. So a world war has been happening now for a solid year. No one has seen a war this big in history. Every nation in the world, almost, at this point, is now involved in this massive conflict between the German Empire and the Allies. And the Germans' allies called the Central Powers.
Yeah.
And it's been a whole year of this at this point. France and Germany are both two military giants that are basically just locked, staring at each other. And at this time, it's the end of 1915, beginning of 1916. The French troops during this time on the front are having movie nights. They're having band practice because the French, you see, have this protection against Germany, which is a series of forts that are lined up on the border. And these forts are so well established that they became known to be impenetrable and unstoppably defensive. And these three forts have names which have pretty much become famous, especially during this time, which are Fort Souvy. Try to pronounce this right, 'cause I don't speak French. Fort Souvy, Fort Vaux, and Fort Douaumont. And these three forts are each garrisoned by about a force of 400 people. And each of these forts also are like underground cities almost. Like they are massive.
Cool. That is pretty neat.
So on the same time, on the German side of this front, there was no movie nights and there was no parties. There was no band practice. Instead, they were being constantly drilled every day to get ready for the inevitable fight. And during this time, the Kaiser himself, Emperor Wilhelm II, visits the front. And he has a meeting at the front with the military staff, including his son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm III. And together, they plan an attack. And this attack is going to be a major offensive into France. So, here's a question for you. If you were planning an attack into France, what would be your choice? What would you do? Let's just say any situation. What is your general plan of attack? Is it attacking the strongest point of the defense?
Probably not.
That's what the Kaiser wanted to do. So they did it. Exactly. The Kaiser said, we're going to hit the strongest point of their defense, and what we're going to do is they're going to have to do so much to protect this point that they're going to lose all their army just trying to protect it.
Yeah, that's brutal, but it makes sense.
Yeah, the point is they'd have to spend so much effort that it would just cause their whole army to do that. And they eventually, they're like, oh, we'll just take out the entire French army if they're all focusing on defending this one point. And so when that plan was agreed upon, the emperor gave his own son, Wilhelm III, command of the forces for it. And here's a quote from the emperor, or from the crown prince at this time, saying, quote, "His Majesty has called us to attack. We must see that Germany's will to win is as hard as steel." End quote. That's what he said to his troops in a speech. So these troops who have been drilling constantly, just night and day working on, they've been practicing their firing, they've been doing drills, they've been doing workouts. Like, these guys are fit to go.
Yeah.
So now it's the beginning of February 1916. The Germans have gathered into thousands to send a massive attack into France, ready to attack the most heavily defended town on the border, which is the battle we're talking about today, the city of Verdun. The German soldiers get so into it. Like, they're like, fuck yeah, Germany rocks kind of thing, right? Yeah. Like, they're getting really patriotic. They're feeling invincible. They're prepared to take on the French. There's a quote from a soldier's journal. "I've got my rifle and 3,000 cartridges by the door. That should get the French on the run." Another soldier wrote to his wife saying, "It's going to be a fight the likes of which the world has never seen."
Jeez, they're pretty pumped about murder.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that last quote is very true. It is definitely going to be something the world has never seen and hasn't seen since. So inside the French fort of Douaumont, there's about 400 men watching movies and playing their instruments and practicing for their army band.
Right.
They're eating cooked meals and enjoying paid relaxation time in the French army, basically, having no idea what would happen in the morning.
Yeesh.
So in the morning, on February 21st of 1916, the French are awoken by the sound of 1,000 storms, as it said. Hundreds of large German artillery cannons firing shells along the French line, focused on atop the fort of Douaumont. Now, I have a map of the battle that I just put up on stream, and you can see in the kind of towards the bottom is Verdun. It's got it's the biggest text, and there's a big gray mark on the river, which is the city. Okay. And if you look to the north, a little bit to the northeast of that, you see Douaumont, which is right underneath where it says 26 February 1916.
Yeah.
So that's where these Germans are just hammering.
That's a fort?
Yeah, that's a fort. It's a huge fort. The French quote from the fortress, the people who survived, said, "We were deafened, our eyes bugged out, we were blown upside down. It was literal hell on earth." And this was the first ever use of German carpet shelling. Basically, they shelled this fortress and the area around it for 5 hours non-stop.
Oh my god.
And they spent 1 million shells.
Jesus Christ.
The French got scattered, they panicked, and they just started running away from the fort, as you would. I will say the fort held. It did not break during this bombardment. But
no fucking way.
The people
Are you serious?
No, the fort fucking it's still there today.
Oh my god.
The fort stood. The people inside were freaking out, thinking there's no way it could survive, so a lot of them left. But again, it's like a small city. Underneath the fort, there is just tunnels upon tunnels, and they connect to the other forts. You can see the three I mentioned are in bold text. You see that Douaumont is north, there's Vaux and Souvy beneath it. So these three fortresses are like the biggest defenders of the French-German border. And I don't think they're connected, but they have tunnels leading towards each other so they can get out and ship supplies between the three. So everyone was running away, and a French officer even has a quote saying, "All we were doing is trying to save face before everyone dies and we all go to hell." Basically meaning, I'm leaving and we're trying to look organized. We have no plan.
Yeah. Oh my god.
And this is the same time during this shelling, a message gets sent to Paris, and Paris finds out about this, and all the politicians start to freak out. Like, what is going on? Why are they attacking Verdun? That's insane. Like, those forces are too tough. Like, why would they do that? The current general, named Joseph Joffre, said that Verdun is too well protected and never needed to fear an attack before this. So what he began to do was strip the fort of their guns and move them north to help the British at the Somme. So they were sending support to the British because they thought, again, there's no way they would ever attack this point. The prime minister got so mad that he grabbed the general, apparently actually by the collar, and yelled at him, saying, "You are to fight to the death. If you lose an inch of this territory, you and your staff are out of a job." So, within the next hour, orders are sent to the front saying one sentence: "You are to fight to the death while awaiting reinforcements."
Yikes.
And this arrived, but it was a little too late, because after 5 days of the attack on the 25th of February, the Germans were 200 yards away now from Fort Douaumont on foot. So they were just above it. Yeah. They were waiting. The soldiers were there. The advance was stopped for a day. They were stopped for the day. Like, they had moved forward. They were starting to set up their they were breaking right behind a hill. And one group of German soldiers didn't want to stop moving. They were so full of fear, and they wanted to keep going forward.
Jesus.
And these soldiers were from Brandenburg. They kind of went down. They kind of are famous. If you know a lot about World War I, this is the very famous story. This group of Brandenburg soldiers said, "We're not going to, the momentum's too hot. Let's attack the fort." And so the captain, Joachim Haupt, got bolt cutters, cut through the French barbed wire, and jumped with his troops of about 15-20 people into the moat of Fort Douaumont.
Oh, shit.
Their superiors didn't know this was happening. So they kept shelling the fort as these guys were trying to get in. So their biggest threat at this time was just friendly fire. And I think one of them gets killed by friendly fire, but the rest get into the fortress right through the front door. Because, much to their surprise, they found the fortress empty. During the disorganized retreat, the French basically left the fort unmanned with a skeleton crew of about 6 people.
Wow.
And no one was watching the door, and no one was looking at the German side because they didn't want to get hit by sniper fire.
Yeah.
So they just walked in and took it. They raised the German flag. The Germans "What the hell is that?" They saw the German man waving at them. They're like, "What the fuck?" And so they sent their guys in, and they're like, "Did you just take the fort?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's ours." So the Germans took the fort. At this time, Germany was the headlines were going crazy. The newspapers, people were freaking out, cheering in the streets for their major victory over the French. The morale was high. People were showing their support for the war. And of course, in France was the exact opposite.
Right. You must have been mortified.
Yeah. There's a big reason too. In France, their headlines read, "If Verdun falls, France falls too." And this was hard hitting to people because I think it was 1870, 50 years ago was the Franco-Prussian War, where the Germans reached Paris after getting through Verdun, which is why those forts were built.
These people have never stopped going to war with each other.
No, they haven't. And now they felt like their one defense, which was so famous, just got taken. So they were pretty hopeless. But luckily for France, a new man just enters the scene. His name is Felipe Tan, and if you know World War I history, Pétain is one of the most legendary generals of all time. And World War II, he is a very, very good French defense strategist. And he, at this point, was basically a nobody. He graduated officer school.
Good for him.
Yeah, he was he was intelligent, but he didn't have any service record. And he was given this crazy task of you have to defend France and the Germans. You're our line.
Cracks knuckles, let's do this.
Basically, that's exactly what happened. And his first job, he had to get as many soldiers to that border as possible. And that's a problem, because at this time, France is much less industrial than Germany. Germany has gone through a massive industrialization, And for a good comparison is France had one country road connecting them to Verdun. Verdun had one single road going from the city to Paris. Germany had not only had about 30 paved roads, but 14 railroads leading to the front.
Jesus Christ.
So this one road that France had became known as a sacred way. I actually have a photo of it right here. This photo is of the event of moving these people and supplies to the front as fast as possible. So this is taking place during that time. It became known as this because it was the only line connecting them. Pétain had to push French. Yeah, and if this road something were to happen to this road, like they didn't have like plane bombers yet, right? Like planes could only go.
Yeah.
World War I aircraft was super basic. It could only go super short distances. So luckily they didn't have to worry about that. But even then, it's if you can tell the road is not paved. It's just dirt.
No.
And early automobiles don't work well on dirt roads. So Pétain had to push the troops like he never had. The French army had never been pushed this hard. They had a pace of 6,000 troop changes per day, and the trucks moving men and supplies day and night to the front. Thousands and thousands of laborers had to be hired to maintain the road 24 hours a day, because it was dirt. Like I said, trucks would break, and the relentless movement of trucks over it. Like this line literally went from France to Verdun of just vehicles. There was it never had a break. Insane. And the dirt would start to fall apart and like crack over the weight of these cars. So they had to constantly stop it.
People like running for.
Yep, people were just on the side, like brushing the road together.
That's amazing. And like changing wheels, it's like a pit stop.
Yeah,
in NASCAR.
exactly.
Like,
Cars would
break. Get a new wheel on.
Cars would break down too. So they had to get mechanics on these roads just come fix these cars as fast as possible.
Lord, yeah.
A soldier in one of these trucks wrote, quote, "The very blood of France is here," end quote. And in the next,
I was gonna say, like, you were saying before, like how France wasn't really training that much; they were kind of just boozing and lounging around and stuff like that. This is a pretty quick training regimen.
Yeah. Oh, these guys, this was a trial by fire right now, and these guys were had to and are going to, as we'll see, step it up. So in the next 10 months, 2/3 of the entire French army would pass on this road. And not only that, but most of their names are going to soon be etched on the monuments of the dead along this road today.
Oh.
Because 2,500,000 men passed on this road.
Jesus.
This is when the French troops who arrived at the front began setting up their concrete defense and created the famous saying, "They shall not pass." So that kind of became the rallying cry for the French at the front, that they would never let the Germans through.
Right.
Now, we talked about how the Germans were in high morale when they took the fort.
Oh, yeah.
Despite that, the entire time they were pushing that fort, the French were also shelling them. They were getting hit by French artillery this entire time. And they weren't having as good of a time as you'd think. I actually have this, which I'll start putting up now. This is just I have a slideshow that I set up of different of what these are actual photos of Verdun. Some of them are colorized, some of them aren't. But let's leave that up for now.
Right. Okay.
So the Germans inside the fort had pretty high morale because but despite taking the fort and having high morale from that, they also suffered extremely high casualties from the French artillery bombardments. And most of the fighting force was exhausted because they were 18 years old. And they had never seen combat before. And one of the most notable casualties of this entire offensive at this point of the war is Franz Mark. Do you know who that is?
No, I do not.
So Franz Mark was one of the most famed painters of the 20th century.
Oh.
His paintings nowadays are still in museums around the world. He's an extremely good kind of realist painter. And he wrote to his wife saying, "All I see is the most frightful spectacle the human brain could imagine." And he sent that letter and died the same day by an artillery shell. So by the time the wife read it, he was already dead. and replied back, and the reply was never received, and we don't know where it is. But according to her, she did write a reply wishing he could be home.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
Yep. So,
well, he's dead.
Yeah, he's dead. A lot of his friends are too. The Crown Prince was also very well aware at this point that the battle wasn't going as good as they had hoped for at the beginning, because they had only advanced 10 kilometers past Fort Douaumont in 2 weeks. Just due to the terrain here is very mountainous. If you've ever seen eastern France, it's a mountain range basically, and the roads are passes between these large hills, and these hills are covered in artillery batteries. So when the German movement is seen, they just start shelling the shit out of the area. And he ordered the offensive, the Crown Prince did, to keep going strong for nothing else than to just save face and make Daddy think he was doing good, as well as to make the men think other parts of the front are doing better. Kind of. It's kind of like tricking them. Like, yeah, you guys are doing great. Keep going.
Yeah, just trying to keep morale up. Yeah.
But they were, again, stuck on the other side of the river across from Verdun. See if I can move this map over. Let's have these both on screen. There we go. You can see the big blue line, not red, on the map is the river, and they were stuck on the other side still. They could not pass over because of the heavy artillery fire. So the Germans came up with a plan that we had to take out those guns, and if we didn't take out those guns, we would never make it on our foot. So these two hills are also famously known now as Côte 304 and Mort Homme, which is its more famous name is Dead Man's Hill. And the reason it's called Dead Man's Hill is actually because they found a body there in the 19th century on the top of the hill. But that's just the beginning of the place's curse, because there has been so many battles in that hill to this day that there is a corpse every square foot, or has been.
Oh, Jesus.
And this hill is one of the most like, it's the easiest way to get into France is through this hill. So every time an army invades, they try to climb the hill. That picture on screen right now, you see the fire on the hill, is a picture of Dead Man's Hill.
Oh, wow.
That's what we're about to talk about right now. In the 6th of March, 1916, Germany launched a full offensive on Dead Man's Hill. But before the Germans even made it to the top, the hill explodes in artillery fire and fire bombs. And
That's incredible.
The amount of artillery from the French sides caused so many German casualties that the hill literally was on fire and the forest burned down. The Germans continued to advance despite this and pushed all the way up to the hill as much as they could. They kind of made it towards the top. And on April 19th, 1916, the battle was getting so fierce up top, the Germans decided to dig a trench. And inside this trench they sat. And inside this trench they would sit for a very long time. Because that is when the battle ground to a halt, and where the most infamous Battle of Verdun happens is this point. Because both sides are now dug in literal feet away from each other in trenches. And this is the World War I many people think of.
Yeah.
Because this is now a dead stalemate with attacks from both sides and both trenches, back and forth, in a tug-of-war between who controls what trench at least once a week.
Yeah, that's the World War I remember.
Yeah, and I wanted to take a break from actually talking about the battle itself to actually talk about the trenches.
Okay.
Because this is something that I really find insane.
Like trench warfare in general?
Yeah, trench warfare and just what life is like in those trenches.
Right.
So, they dug these trenches out, and for those who don't know, firstly, trench warfare is, I think it started in the American Civil War, and it became, because in the American Civil War, if you aren't aware, a lot of people watched. There was literally observation balloons from, like, France and Germany, and Britain, watching the battles.
Wow, that's fucking wild, actually.
Yeah, because not only had we invented automatic weapons, but there was other things in that war, like the tactics, like trench warfare, that no one had seen before. And they're like, oh, check this out. This is crazy. We need to know this stuff. And they would have people on hills with binoculars, like just like German immigrants watching and like reporting back to Germany. So
I want to see a movie about those people.
That would actually be a crazy story to like follow the battles around, because I want to do a Civil War episode too, because that also was horrific.
Yeah,
it is closest, I think, to World War One and how horrible the conditions were.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, that's trench warfare. You dig in a trench, and you just kind of stop them from getting forward because they can't really see you, and you fire over the trench. And the idea is every day you kind of like check the front, see if you can see them, kind of make a guess on how many people the officers would, and then order an offensive. And the people in the trench would jump out of the trench as fast as they possibly could, charge forward in a straight line, and get in the enemy trench and basically beat them to death because they didn't have automatic weapons, and take the trench and make them leave their trench and go back to a further trench behind it, or take the trench and win the battle. Right. World War One changed.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it's terrible. And World War One changed it entirely with the invention of the machine gun.
Yeah.
The trenches now had machine guns mounted on them, so when you would get out of the trench to push forward, they would mow down the entire line of people without stopping a single second. And there would just now be a line of corpses and dying people screaming in front of their friends and comrades in the trench behind them.
Yeah.
So that was a big change. It became so impossible to make the run that the land between the trenches became known as no man's land.
Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah, and usually no man's land is just, you see it in movies and stuff, it's just a flat plain of mud because there's been so many artillery shells, all the trees are gone, all the rocks are gone, everything's gone. It's just mud as far as you can see to the enemy trench, which also means it's much easier for the enemy to see you.
Oh yeah, it's just like a barren wasteland. And there's occasionally dead bodies and barbed wire.
Yep. Zero cover. Like, you get up, when you're standing up, you're basically dead. So to counter this, they started to do what were known as night raids.
Of course, naturally.
So what you would do for the idea of a night raid is that you would get up at night and crawl through the mud. You would be crawling through the mud, prone, at night. Literally look over the edge, pretending to be a body, into the enemy trench. Jump in the enemy trench, usually wearing a helmet from their uniform. Climb out the other side of the trench, and then wait for morning when your offensive line would attack, and you would take out the machine guns from behind, and as many people as you could.
Whoa.
So one group in particular became very, very good at this, and that was the Germans. And you probably have heard of them. The Sturmtruppen, or the Stormtroopers, were the German elite troops that became excellent at night raids. And they were usually formed of convicts and criminals who were extremely savage and would care nothing about people's life, and even their own men. If they were being loud or started to get scared, they would just kill the man next to them.
Yeah.
And they were deadly efficient, and most of the German victories were all due to this. And so but even with that, sometimes the night raids would get caught because there was other trenches behind their trenches that were also, like, there was lines and lines of trenches, right? It wasn't just one trench.
It's not just one trench.
So they would see them, stand up from behind, and take them out. And so it wouldn't work every time. Even when it did, it didn't mean they would succeed. They would still be firing outside of their trenches.
And that's still a suicide squad, because even when the action begins and you start firing from behind, there's going to be people behind you that are just going to
see you. That's what I mean. The trench behind you would see you and kill you. Yeah, so it was very dangerous. And when the other troop, or other side, I should say, let's say they crossed no man's land, which did happen, and they get into the trench, what do you do? Because your rifle only has one bullet in it, and you probably fired it coming out forward. And say you have a bayonet on your rifle, which you do when you're charging across no man's land. You stab a dude, your rifle is now stuck in this man.
Yeah.
It's not like a game or something where you just keep stabbing. Like, you have one hit, and now you're surrounded by French or Germans in this very close quarters combat. Now, some people were fortunate enough to have pistols, and pistols were at this time like the deadliest weapon of the war because they were semi-automatic, and that's a lot of people you could take down in a trench.
Yeah.
But normally, it was down to clubs, trench knives, brass knuckles, swords, and grenades. That was the common weapon for fighting in a trench.
It's like they go from like modern day warfare with machine guns and pistols and such, and then when they go into the trench, it goes right back to medieval warfare with swords and clubs and
100%.
pistols, but
they even wore armor. They had armor.
Yeah.
People wore metal armor in the trenches because they were ready for trench attacks. There was even specialist troops used by the Germans and the French in Verdun specifically, known as the Trench Raiders. If you ever played Battlefield 1, it's a specialist kit you can get in that game, and they would wear helmets and full armor, and their job was to just jump into the enemy's trench, usually using a large two-handed club to just do as much damage as possible. It was very unsuccessful because one bullet would still cut through the armor and kill the person underneath.
right.
So it wasn't used very much, but it was a tactic that they tried to employ for a little bit. But
That's the war of seeing what these things can go up against, though, because nobody knew the extent of bullets and guns quite yet, and then they were figuring it out during this war. Like, that's what this war gets a lot of credit for. It's like being innovative in war. Like,
yeah.
World War II was fought very different. Like, that's why people, I don't like, it's interesting that people compare World War I and World War II just because of their namesake, because they're very different wars.
Oh, yeah.
Also Germany being the opponents, but
the biggest thing about World War I, too, is it's a war of kings.
right.
It's kings and empires fighting against each other, and that changes a lot of things because they can have more authority over ordering troops, right?
Yeah.
More control for the leaders who don't know what they're doing, which we're going to get into soon. But another big innovation that you said about new weapons during this time was gas.
Yeah.
So
I figured we were going to get to that eventually.
Yeah, the battle in the trenches was fought oftentimes always with a gas mask on hand because the Germans started it, but despite what we think of, every side kind of used it, which is you would throw gas bombs into the enemy trench and it would release mustard gas, which, if you don't know, basically just makes you cough yourself to death in a couple minutes. Extremely painfully. It's extremely easy to make as well, which made it very prevalent. Which is even the picture on screen right now. You see a German wearing a gas mask, probably with a gas grenade in his hand that he's getting ready to throw, which is why he has a mask on in case it goes off right next to him. But let's stop even talking about fighting for a moment, because there'd be days and weeks of them just in the trenches, living there.
Yeah, they'd just be sitting.
Yeah, staring at each other. Day after day, artillery shells constantly landing around them, sniper fire constantly landing around them. Sometimes an aerial bomber would hit. At this time, what planes would do is they would fly over, and a man in the back seat would literally grab a bomb by their hand and drop it out the side of the plane. So it wasn't very accurate in how they landed things, but sometimes they would hit. Much weaker than artillery shells as well. But they tried to get more specific hits on with them. But again, they also had very short air range, so they couldn't do it very often. So living in these trenches was the most hellish experience any human can live through.
I mean, you're just eating, pissing, shitting, not showering
In a trench with everyone else, shoulder to shoulder. You were in so close proximity with people. There was a spike of dysentery.
Yeah.
Cholera, and typhoid fever. So these would just spread like crazy through the trenches. Everyone would get extremely sick for days at a time and still have to fight.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I imagine fighting with typhoid.
Yeah, again, and standing in mud all day long causes a condition known as trench foot.
Yeah.
Which, if you don't know what trench foot is, basically the entire bottom of your your feet, it rots away, and while skin is growing underneath it so you can still stand, it is extraordinarily painful. Don't walk around with wet feet. That's very dangerous. I almost said teeth, because the other thing that would happen a lot is trench mouth. Have you ever heard of this?
I have not heard of trench mouth.
Yeah, it still exists, but almost no one has it, because what it's caused by is when you grit your teeth so hard that your teeth split through your gums and starts to get infected and starts to just because you can't take care of it. And this is caused in World War I by them clenching their mouth due to the constant artillery fire. They would just be clenching their jaws, taking cover, and it would just start to do that to them.
Just anxiety. This is
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Another side effect is shell shock, which nowadays we know as PTSD.
Yeah.
The constant shelling would cause them to get about an hour of sleep a day, if even. They would deal with literal piles of corpses inside the trench and outside the trenches. Bodies that they couldn't move without getting killed, so they just let them sit there. These bodies would start to decay, and the smell of death was so ever prevalent that survivors are noted to having gotten used to it, and when new soldiers would show up, they would start to vomit multiple times per day before getting used to it. Yeah, great times.
Good time. Look, freedom ain't free, bitch.
Yeah, and
I
soldiers.
don't know what point I'm trying to make that. I'm trying to make a joke.
France isn't free for nothing.
Look, for the last, what is it, like 36 minutes of this podcast, I've been like, find your end, man. Be the funny guy. I'm like, I can't.
How do you make a joke about this? It's hard, especially because these are real people we're talking about.
Yeah.
Who are dying by the droves horribly. And so another thing I kind of mentioned before is sniper fire. So sniping was invented by the Americans in the Revolutionary War. It didn't really see much use, however, around any other country except America. In the American Civil War, it became even more prevalent, and like I said, people were watching. So these other countries started inventing what we know now as sniper rifles by putting telescopes on top of guns. And the German and the French were actually famous for being some of the best at this. And during the Battle of Verdun, you would just constantly hear the pings of bullets just hitting the ground around you, missing you by an inch because some sniper saw your head pop up.
Yeah.
And it became so bad that you would have an order, for example, like 4 men would be told to go get water buckets. So they would get out of the trench, leave, go down, like behind them, get water, and come back. And they would notice only 2 of them came back.
Huh.
And the 2 that came back wouldn't even notice a lot of time. They just got so desensitized by it, they wouldn't even notice that their trench mate got shot in the head.
Oh, at that point, your body literally can't function on a conscious level anymore. You're acting on instinct, and your instincts can very much be what you learned in training. So getting water is part of that instinct. It's not surprising.
And many of the soldiers also said they would stop calling each other by name, but by number, because having friends is useless in the trench because they're dead tomorrow.
Yeah. Of course. No, again, stuff like this is what takes away all humanity. It's just
true. And so this is the first time anything had been so horrible in war ever, based in modern times at least, right?
Right. Yeah.
And this gives World War I the reputation of being the most horrific conflict in history.
Yeah.
In numbers wise, every 1 in 10 soldier to be in World War I died. And that outside the USA, which is 1 in 40, but
we joined later.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say every other country is 1 in 10, which is the highest death rate to this day in any modern war. So every 1 in 10 was dead before they even made it out the door, and
that's fucking wild.
It's just that was dying from the trenches.
Europeans, man. Dude,
yeah.
What is it with these goddamn Europeans?
And it's just all power struggles and craziness. Yeah. I can go a lot into the French. We're not going to going deep into the German Empire in this episode, because an important thing to note here is that while in Verdun they are the offense, in the war they are not the offender. They are the defending force. Yeah. They did not start the war. The Central Powers and German Empire are not the same as the Nazis in World War II. A lot of people confuse that. Very different.
There were what, like almost 2 decades between. Like, there's something to consider.
Yeah, no, completely.
A lot can change in 10 years.
It was a completely different people. Nothing. Yeah. They were very imperial, and they were very like, we're the best, but they weren't to any kind of Holocaust level bad at all.
Yeah.
But now I just want to talk a little bit about what trench warfare was like and how fucking horrendous it was, so you understand what these people are going through day to day.
Yes.
Because now we're going to go back to the timeline of the war.
Right.
And back in France, where Pétain has become a hero now. Because while this battle is a stalemate, in the war of attrition, a stalemate is a win for defense.
It's true.
So the French were winning this battle, technically, because they weren't being pushed back. He gave a very famous speech saying, with his famous quote, "They shall not pass. Courage, we'll get them." Now, if you know about World War II, in France, "Courage will get them" became the slogan for Free France and the French partisans, and was often written on walls of German-occupied buildings in France. So this
Cool.
that saying would be heralded for the next World War as well.
That's so classic French. Like, if you just think about French history, it's just like, they're so rebellious.
It's a nation of rebels, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes me proud to have a little bit of French in blood in me.
But people shit talk the French all the time, but if you know military history, they are a force to fucking be reckoned with, and they are not a joke.
Literally the only reason why people joke about France is because in World War II they got pushed back. And they called for help, and it's just like, that's really nothing to mock them for, to be honest. Like,
yeah, it's they gave World War One is a great example. If you think World War II France is a pushover, look at the World War One history and see that they were fucking heroes. So that's the French side of things. On the German side of things, a soldier writes, "We have been greatly deceived by our officers."
Ooh.
So this is a letter written home.
That's how it starts.
Another part of this letter says, "We want those responsible for the war to be fighting by our sides. If they'd done so, we would have had peace long ago."
Oh, man.
That's something you hear echoed all the time nowadays, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But that was never said before. And this letter became public in Germany. It's very famous now. I believe it's in a museum in Germany. And it became a rallying cry to the people back then in 1916 to stop the war. The war was crazy. People were dying in droves. It was endless. Peace rallies began. Every day, more and more families got news of dead husbands and sons, brothers. Orphanages started having so many children in it that they had to start sending them out to the streets instead.
Sounds like a villain's origin story.
Yeah. The orphan sent to the street.
Yeah.
Adolf. Okay, anyway. In France at this time, life has basically gone back to normal. Their war economy was very successful. People were finding work in making bullets and shells. They acted as if the Battle of Verdun was won. Many civilians went on with day-to-day life as if there wasn't a massive death mill, like, miles away from them.
Which is fucking wild to think about. It's just
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, go 100 miles up that way, and everyone's dying. Go south, and people are getting coffee and stuff. Like,
Yeah, so besides all the deaths before this, during the stalemate of trench warfare at this time, which we're now hitting the beginning of April, and that started in March, the trench warfare. Let me see, I have the date right here. It was April 19th where the trench thing started, sorry. So by the end of April, 60,000 dead at Verdun. That is That's lot insanity. Of people. That is for insane. For a month, 60,000 dead in combat. The death rate was 1 every 2 minutes.
Oh my god. Every 2 minutes, you can just count someone's dead.
Mm-hmm. Imagine knowing that and being in a trench, like watching your watch. Like, I made it in another 2 minutes.
Yeah,
it wasn't me.
Knowing me and my personality type, if I was in that would probably be my game. I would probably always look at the clock and every 2 minutes and be like, "It wasn't me. It wasn't me." And that would probably how I'd do until I blew up, and then I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, then you wouldn't be saying it anymore.
Yeah.
So this spring had hit. Germany was crying for a swift end of the battle. France was calling out for glorious vengeance. Neither side wanted this battle to end, really. Like the soldiers, at least. They wanted to win. In April 1916, Verdun was practically gone. I think there's one of these pictures you'll see that's going through the slideshow. When you see the town, it's Verdun at this time. It's basically been shelled out of existence.
Yeah.
The population had fled months ago. To France, this is a huge success. They can freely move about the city without fear of shelling due to the grinding of the halt up on the hill.
Right.
So during this time, there was a big thing that happened. International politicians and press members and leaders gathered in Verdun to praise the French on standing alone against Germany and holding the seemingly impossibly endless army of death, quote unquote, at bay. In history, no nation had ever been able to stop Germany like this. And many countries would take note of this defensive tactic, which would again open up trench warfare on all the other fronts, including Russia.
Right.
Experts knew that Germany would never pass and the battle would ground to a halt. Now, the worst part about this is, strategically, Verdun was now nothing. It was a dead town. The lines behind Verdun were stronger than the lines in front of Verdun now. The British were also on the lines behind Verdun in higher number, and the British were a professionally trained army, not recruits like France. They were a much stronger force. Like, they knew what they were doing. And the North was being hit hard by the British. So the Germans needed to be supporting the North more than they were at the Somme, which is another huge battle. I'll probably do an episode on later. And Verdun held absolutely zero strategic purpose. There was no point at this time for this battle to go on. The city was... What are you going to say?
I was gonna say it all started because basically some German general was like, we want to be cocky and take Verdun because
it was not a German general, the Emperor.
The Emperor, sorry, right.
The Emperor himself was like, we're gonna take Verdun and we're gonna show how good we are.
It's literally, but it was not strategic at all.
No, not at all. It's not a strategic point. There's better places across the river. There's easier terrain to pass. There's no reason to take Verdun. And especially now that the city's gone, you're not getting anything out of this city. It's completely destroyed. The industry's gone. The farming is gone. The people are gone.
Yeah.
This battle would lead, if you were to take it, like I said, you go into more defensible terrain for the French. The Somme at the north was a huge strategic point, however, because like World War II, going through the north is how you get into France. That's the safe way to do it because the border is too defended. And that was where the Somme was, where the British were holding with French support. But the Germans didn't want to see the battle to a lose because it would be embarrassment. So they kept the line going. The French, being praised by the world for not letting the Germans take an inch, refused to let up, and they kept garrisoning the front. This battle, for no point, would continue for 8 more bloody, unnecessary months, with a death toll the world has never, and still hasn't for a battle, ever seen before.
Jesus Christ. It's just like, so how many months is that in total? What is it, 10 months of just straight trench warfare?
It's the battle itself is 11 months long.
11 months long.
Yeah, so it's almost an entire year.
Right, it literally says it on the screen. I just
yeah, you say February, December. So it's 11. Yeah, it's like 10ish to 11ish months long.
Yeah. Jesus Christ.
So the next big moment is the 22nd of May, 1916. The French finally desire to take back their pride. They're going to take Fort Douaumont. It has been sitting there in sight. The generals knew this would be extremely difficult, but because there was heavy German artillery guns covering the entire area, but they needed a victory for the press and for the soldiers to make it look like they were heroes.
Yikes.
So
that's not a reason to do that.
No, it's not. Again, like I was saying, this is a weird age where granted France is a republic at this time. It's not they don't have a king ruling them, but they still had to impress the kings around them. So they decided we're going to make this massive forward push, and they do. They send out tons of troops. And for the first few hours, they made it. They got right to the fort. And they were able to overcome the German trenches by their massive forward push. The Germans got pushed back and back in their trenches. They hadn't seen this land since the turn of the year, the French. So they're back to where they used to be. The troops reached the foothold of the foothold of the fort, and then the German artillery hit. With a crushing defeat and 5,000 French dead, they lost all progress made.
Oh my God.
So this entire French offensive meant for absolutely nothing. And this was the perfect show of how this battle, was for nothing but ego and prestige.
Oh,
and
that's so sad.
A famous quote from a general who after the death of the general that was charging, got put to the front, says, "You feel like an animal being herded into the abattoir." As he arrived in the trench, that's what he wrote down in his journal.
Jesus Christ.
At this time, there is 1 ton of explosions going off every square meter.
Right.
There is 60 million shells being spent. Death has become so common that bodies are now being piled up, kind of for shells to hit, so that it'll stop a mess of bodies. That's how they basically got rid of the corpses.
It's blowing them into pieces.
Yeah, they just piled up their dead on a thing and hope a German artillery shell or French artillery shell would hit it and take care of the incineration for them. It was now spring, and France is beautiful, right? Famously for their spring.
Well, probably not Verdun right now. But
No,
yeah.
but that's my point. Flower fields are going crazy. Troops get out of their training, are headed right to the front, and are met by having to leave the flowers and crawl through mud, blood, the excrement of people, and dead people. Men are drowning in shell craters, literally in mud. That's got to be probably the most horrific way to go. You survive an artillery hit and go into a shell, and then it gets so full with mud you drown.
Yeah, that's probably it. I mean, a lot of, if I'm not mistaken, like, one of our favorite authors of all time, Tolkien, was in World War I.
Yeah, he was at the Somme.
Yeah, right. And like a lot of what he wrote about in Lord of the Rings was inspired by what he saw in this war.
Yeah, there's a whole book. I think it's called Taking Tolkien is the name of the book, and it goes into how everything is the analog for the First World War, like the trolls are the tanks, the orcs the Germans, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Also during this time, soldiers are now consuming more alcohol than ever, which has caused a boom in British and French alcohol sales.
That's good for the economy.
Yeah, it is. France's economy is actually doing kind of good right now. At the end of the war, it does not, but right now it's kind of hitting hard. Patriotism is completely gone at this point. The French soldiers don't give a shit about their country. They are fighting out of routine and duty, and the fact that if they retreat, it's death. It's a death sentence.
Right.
So they just stay there and die. The beginning of June now. Erich von Falkenhayn, who is the leader of the German military, head of the army, at least on the Verdun side of the things, wants to lead an assault to pin down and stop the French support of the British at the Somme, because the Somme is not going super well for the Germans either. And to do this, he decides that we need to have a huge offensive. And the Crown Prince himself, who's in charge of the troops directly, knows this is useless. And he has a quote saying, "In my heart, I was opposed to this offensive, but I had to follow orders, so I forced myself to appear confident."
I hate people like that.
So the Crown Prince was going around telling everyone, good old Wilhelm III, like, well, let's go, guys, let's go. But he knew everyone was fucking dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a new German
They
gun.
had to do it back then. Yeah.
Yeah, a new German gun came out too. There's a picture of it on screen, as you can see how massive it is. This new German gun, I think it's known as Big Mac. Big Marks is the name of this gun.
Big Mac, the Big Mac.
Is it Big Max? That's it, Big Max. So this gun is known as Big Max. It's on a railroad, and this gun can fire a shell that weighs 1 ton.
Yeesh.
So this 1 ton shell is so deadly that they start lighting the world on fire between Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. Now you can see on this map where Douaumont and Vaux are, the two, I guess, like pinkish pentagons kind of next
Pentagon. On the rightish side,
They're right next to each other. You can't see them. So in between those two lands, they just start shelling the hell out of it with these giant cannons. So they make their massive push, and they hit Fort Vaux, which is fully manned with 400 men, and the Germans managed to encircle the fort. These men inside this fort now, after a couple of days, they're out of ammo, water, and food.
Yep. That's how you win a siege.
Yeah, they're completely cut off, but they stay vigilant because the rest of France is watching. Now, I want to do a whole other subpart, kind of Life in the Trenches, about life in the fort, because people were dying of suffocation because doors would close and they couldn't open them because they were too weak to open them. People were licking the walls for water. Like, it was horrifying for these people inside this fort. But on June 4th, 1916, the Germans breached the fort because they found an underground tunnel.
Oh.
They got inside with grenades, flamethrowers, maces, clubs, and knives and swords, and they had a massive battle. The Germans ended up winning, of course. And a side note to that is that while the Germans did win, the French were allowed to leave with full military accord. Oh. The Germans said they were such good defenders, they gave them food and water and let them go back to France.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah, basically they honored their defense, and it was that's very how war was like a game to these generals. Right, like, so you were this was the last war ever like that, and it's kind of stopping because now the generals are kind of dying in the front as well. But besides that, like, it's just kind of like they're like, "Oh, you guys did such a good job. Here's a medal for you guys," and it's just like they don't care.
Yeah,
you know, they're dying, but it's just, so disconnected.
Yeah, that is pretty fucking wild.
But
hey, you did a good job not dying.
Here's your participation medal. Yeah, I think they did actually get German medals for it. Like, they gave them medals. But back to this going on. They took the fort. Germans had now control of Fort Vaux, which is another huge win for Germany. Germany's made a huge push in this battle that had no stalemate, right?
Yeah, right. Where's that hill? Where is the hill, by the way? I that's one thing I couldn't get on the map, was where the big hill was.
So it's not marked on this map, but it's basically where Douaumont is. Like, Douamont's right beneath it. You see there's that little pink circle, like below the gray circle where Douaumont is, like to the bottom, like down to the left.
A little?
Yeah. That is the artillery battery on the fortress, on the hill.
On the hill. Okay, so that's probably the okay, so that's where they had that big no man's land.
Someone in chat, Yeti Wrangler asked, wait, so the Germans gave the French troops medals? They gave them full military accords, if not a medal, at least a ribbon. They were given praise for their defense.
That's pretty wild.
By the Germans, because they were holding out for so long in such horrible conditions.
Hey, you guys really deserve this.
Yeah, and they let them go too. They didn't take them prisoner. So with Fort Vaux in control, they now had a direct pass to Fort Souvy, which was the final fort holding the wall.
Right.
And this could be the end of the battle. They could have taken Fort Vaux and stopped. They could have just held the line and stopped pushing and stopped digging trenches, but they were ordered to continue because Verdun must fall by Falkenhayn's orders. So they push forward. The path now open to Fort Souvy. The 11th of July, 1916, the Germans climbed the hill of Fort Souvy, and guess what they can see in the distance? The famous Cathedral of Verdun.
Oh, wow, there it is.
It's visible for the first time to the German. Victory is in reach, and the men are spurred forward. So the Germans attack this small village between them, which you can see on the map. Directly below Douaumont is a little gray dot called Flouillet. This village of Flouillet, if you were to go to Google right now and look for it on Google Maps, it's not there.
Oh.
Because it's gone. Because this attack would wipe it off the map. They would take this city, the Germans would. A great victory. The next day, a massive French assault takes back the city of Flouillet with more destruction to it. The next week, a massive German assault takes back the city of Flouillet.
Jesus. They should just make a movie about Flouillet.
They probably have.
Probably.
It was taken and retaken a dozen times in 2 weeks. The Battle of Flouillet is representation of the term heroic and pointless, a sentiment which is now associated with Verdun. This battle has now gone on for 6 months at this point. 100,000 dead, 120,000 wounded or captured.
Heroic and pointless.
There's a famous quote here. The war has been going on too long. Just one more push, they said in March, April, May, and June. Reinforcements have just arrived, and they're even younger men. The infantry struck at the heart of France. They told them they were defending their country. They were defending Germany. They believed it, but when they saw it wasn't working, they looked back at the generals and said, whose fault is all this? As almost a response to that famous quote, Falkenhayn is blamed for the German failure to push and is given a stigma for sending an entire generation of Germans to their death.
Yeah, I mean, he did.
And at the end of August, the Kaiser replaces Falkenhayn with two men, Erich Ludendorff, and Paul von Hindenburg, who are two generals from the Eastern Front, and he sends them to the west to deal with the French offensive, while Romania declares war on Germany in the east.
Great.
Falkenhayn is sent as a punishment to go deal with them because they're so pathetic that there can be no glory seen in winning against the Romanians.
That's poor Romanians.
Yeah, not a power.
Yeah, rough go about it, guys. Sorry.
And a fun side note here, Hindenburg would become president of Germany after the war, and in 1933 appoint Adolf Hitler as his chancellor.
Great.
So,
Good job, buddy.
Yeah, good job, guy.
Well, way to knock it out of the park for the follow-up.
When this happened, the French were spurred with a little bit of patriotism because they're like, look, the German replaced their command. Like, let's take him out. And at this point, the battle has become a legend in France. The Somme, which was happening in the north, which was a British and French offensive, the joint offensive, didn't carry... It was deadlier and maybe even a bigger battle than Verdun, but it didn't have as much of a weight to it because it was also with the British, right? With Verdun, it was just France. And this replacement of German commands starts to mix things up. But guess what? The battle continued.
Why? Well, why not at this point? At this point, you might as well just keep it going.
Let's just never let it end. You know,
why are we still doing it?
The commanders would order trench raids, fort assaults on small gaps. Territory would be taken weekly, only to have it lost again the next week. Just right back at that grinding trench halt. Between September and December of 1916, 47,000 more French would die. On the 24th of October 1916, the final French assault of Verdun would happen. They attacked Fort Douaumont. The beginning of it all, the prestige of France was on the line, the fort that started this whole battle, and 9 months after its capture, it's finally taken back by the French.
And even after that pathetic attempt where 5,000 dudes died.
Yep, this time was bigger, more than 5,000 men. There was about 10,000 men attacking that fort, and taking the fort was met with the surrender of the Crown Prince's men. In droves, they were so tired of fighting, the Germans just waved the white flag on the line and said, just take us. We don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
On the French side, 160,000 dead, 210 wounded. On the German side, 140,000 dead, 190,000 wounded. With the taking of the fort, the fight came to a standstill, and in the winter of 1916, after 300 days, the battle finally came to an end with the retreat of the Germans. In the following weeks and months after this, the French would push forward and take the border of Germany, following the retreat of them until they awaited the Americans the next year to push into the Ardennes forest and take Germany. And that is the end of Verdun.
Jesus Christ. What a wild time. And
So
that sounded like a soccer mom. Wow, what a wild time.
just for the final number count, 400,000 dead.
400,000.
500,000 wounded.
Mm-hmm.
At this war. And keep in mind, most of those wounds are debilitating and they'll never have a normal life again.
Yeah. And all because a German emperor wanted to show how big his penis was. And his penis wasn't that big because his penis got cut off and ran home. So, clearly it wasn't very large.
Yeah, it's just the whole point of this battle that makes it wild to me in my head is how fucking pointless it was.
Yeah. Honestly, that's kind of the thing that I can't stop thinking about is that, like, because this is the stuff that to this, like, today makes me absolutely we're Verdun. It's something that I think about a lot to this day is that, like, it's sad, but there are still so many things that are done for ego, like in 2021, you know.
Yeah.
And it just, and like, I hope to fuck nothing's like that anymore, you know. And like that's like really the
of course, I don't think we're ever going to reach, unless of course, fuck me if I'm wrong, but ever going to reach any kind of war to the scale of these two world wars we have ever had before. You know, at least between nations on Earth, simply because the advancements of technology have lessened the amount of casualties.
Right. Unless you just drop a bomb.
Right.
Like,
No, I'm talking about actual combat soldiers fighting each other, right? But it's just, it was so horrific. World War One, I feel like, is underappreciated in its historical importance compared to the Second World War.
I agree. Because a lot of quote unquote, which sounds silly, but rules of war were made because of World War One. That were implemented in World War Two. One of the reasons why World War Two was fought the way it was fought was because of World War One.
Also, the invention of the bomber plane basically stopped the appearance of trench warfare. While there was trenches in the Second World War, trench warfare never took place.
Right. Yeah. There wasn't because I just finished watching Band of Brothers about a couple weeks ago, and they cover a very famous battle there, and I want to talk about this one a little bit.
The Battle of the Bulge.
Battle of the Bulge, because that's the time where they're in trenches.
It was the closest thing to trench warfare had.
Yeah, because that was a good example, but it wasn't nearly as long. No, it was a long time, but it wasn't nearly as long. And they also had bombing planes that would fly overhead sometimes too. So wild.
There's also a famous story at the beginning of the First World War, which was when the French did their first attack. They sent their whole army into Germany, crossed the border. They were meeting no resistance. They were marching in formation. There was officers on horseback behind them, right? They were treating it like it was the 1800s, and they were doing another fancy war.
Right,
A good example of this was their bright blue uniforms.
Yeah.
Which
ridiculous.
They were moving in their bright blue uniforms going forward, and they all died to German artillery. And the French wrote an angry worded letter to the German Kaiser of how dare they use artillery instead of meeting in field in line combat. And
his response was probably, "Well, no shit, dude."
His response was basically, "Get fucked, LOL." It's just right? It was so different. And then when they started fighting, they couldn't see the Germans because Germans always wore deep black. That was the color of the German army. Now they were wearing gray or colors that blend or camouflage. And it was things had changed. The world had drastically changed overnight for war, and the French weren't ready for it. They still were using it, the old line fighting, Prussian War, and dealing with those old Swedish Empire, 50 Years War, that kind of thing. They were still doing it that way, which was just dead. That was an old way of fighting that would never exist again.
Yep, because it literally just exposes you. I mean, it's something that happened in the Revolutionary War as well, where the British would literally be marching their troops wearing bright red coats. I mean, down the roads, and then the Americans would just pop out of ditches, and blow them away.
Yeah, one of the reasons why the British lost is we didn't follow the rules, and that's kind of what happened. And just for people who don't understand World War One, it started with the assassination of a duke from Austria, and they attacked Serbia. The Austrians attacked Serbia, who assassinated the duke, and the Austrians' closest ally was Germany. And Germany was forced legally to also be part of the war. Serbia's ally was France, and they were forced legally to be part of the war, as well as Russia was part of that alliance. So it just basically, Germans were forced into a war they didn't want to be in, and they did not attack. They were defensive. They were defenders of this whole thing. If you could go back and forth on who was the good guy or the bad guy in this war, it's not an easy thing to answer because everyone involved is now long dead. Of course, the Germans started using flamethrowers and gas weapons, so that doesn't help their case.
No, but it's not their, but to be fair, at the same time, it's they were just doing industry things.
Yeah,
that's just what industry produces, and they were just ahead. And I mean, again, it's horrific because they were fighting and they were killing people with those tools. But you can't fault them for just being hey, look what we discovered. Look what we invented.
Also, if you don't know German history or European history, Germany was a new country. They had just unified at this time. They were like 30 years old. Like they didn't. Germany was like 6 different countries forever. It was like Brandenburg and Prussia and Saxony. They had just connected as one country called Germany. So they were kind of like, and they were booming off of it. They were getting together, and they were very industrial, and they were making a lot of money.
Yeah, and like actually, friend of the show and old streamer buddy Leon Benetzer is our German friend. We've actually talked about this a couple of times. We're like, he actually refers to that unification of Germany as something he's always been really proud of, his German history, because he always thought it was really great that people could set aside their German differences and work in German favor.
Yeah, German differences that went back like 1,000 years.
Oh,
like a lot of bad blood was put aside for the unification of Germany.
Yeah, and that is genuinely something to be proud of, but that's not part of German history, at least in America, because again, the first thing you think of in German history in America is
the Nazis, Hitler. That's what we were taught. But there was a different Germany much before that, and they were very much more inclusive. It was a much different place. There's a fun fact too, talking about strongly worded letters, is Woodrow Wilson also got one from the Kaiser about shotguns.
Right.
Because we were told shotguns was cheating, because we were the first people to bring our home defense shotguns to the trenches, and we were talking about trenches having problems with shooting. When the Americans showed up with shotguns, it became a one-sided fight, and the trenches were very soonly irrelevant.
Good Lord. Yeah, but you just sprayed one shotgun shell in the trench, you could hit 3 dudes.
I can't remember what it's called, but there's a famous shotgun that's still used today, kind of. You've seen it in a lot of games. It's got a wooden handle and a wooden pump, and the top of it is like grated. Like it's got holes in it. That shotgun, it was the first pump-action shotgun to be reliable and not break, and it was used in the First World War heavily by American soldiers.
Damn.
And they would just go in. It got the nickname the trench sweeper, because they would go in and just hold that, just pump as fast as you can and pull the trigger, and the Germans just fall over. Yeah, Yeti Rinko said the model 1897, I think. Yeah, I think that's what it is. You can still get them today. It's a very reliable weapon.
So also, I'm just going to say, you're welcome, everybody.
Thank you, guys. You're welcome.
You're welcome.
I would love to do a whole episode just in the politics of World War One, because holy shit, it was crazy, especially for America. The back and forth every month, Senate arguing, should we get involved, should we not?
Yeah, I knew about that stuff, because I knew about the American history about World War One, because it's very, like, again, my history teacher was always like, we kind of stayed on the sidelines for a long time.
Also, famously, the cutting of the transatlantic cable, which was the British would cut the cable, and so they could censor our news. Yeah. And the British corrupted the American news with censorship to make us think that the Germans only were killing children and gassing trenches and not doing anything, and they were monsters, to get us on their side, and it worked. Because America was in favor of joining the Central Powers, not the Allies before that.
Well, it was a defensive thing.
Yes, exactly. Not only were they attacked, and they were trying to help themselves against this French and British alliance, but I don't want to get... Yarkis is right. I don't want to get... I'm not going to say anything anti-Semitic right now. For clarification, a lot of the banks in America were run by Jewish immigrants who are German.
Right.
And they wanted to help Germany because they're German. And they controlled the money of America.
Which is kind of ironic, because it's like later on...
Yes, exactly. We know what would happen to these Jewish people. A lot more would come to America.
Yeah, but it's funny though that because back in World War One though, the Jewish they were trying to fight for Germany, which is the irony there. Is that they were pushing America to fight for Germany, and 20 years later Adolf would be like, I don't care.
Yeah, and it was winning. So there's a great channel. If you love World War One history, there's a great channel on YouTube called The Great War. I did use that as a source here. This channel did for the centennial event of World War One, it did a week-by-week update for the entirety of the length of the war. And it's fantastic. The host, Indy Nidell, is a historian I love, an inspiration of mine. He goes super into it, and he talks about this happening in America, and if I remember correctly, I think Congress was 1 vote away from joining the Central Powers.
Oh, wow.
We were
that would have a lot of history.
Very close. Oh, yes. That would have been drastically different. There's even There's even draw-up plans for defending the border against the Canadian military, attacking Britain. That kind of stuff. Like, it got that far. Like, they were really thinking about joining the Central Powers to help Germans. Because there was a lot of German Americans, and not only that, we hated the British. We were not friends with them at that point. Like, we didn't have a good relationship with Britain. They tried to help the South out in the Confederate war, with the Confederates.
Yeah,
like,
right.
that was the last interaction we had. Like, it was not a good relationship. Nowadays, we're fucking two peas in a pod. But back then, we were not friendly. And
you know, this is definitely bringing. This would segue really great. I should probably do World War II next week because this segues kind of one of the things that I wanted to talk about on World War II is ego, and like because that's like one of the things we were talking about with the politicians, and like the Emperor of Germany in this time was like trying to basically stroke his ego by showing how big his army was, and so it's like I think that like World War II is a good example of like the last war that was about pure ideology, because everything after that, basically wars like Vietnam, South, like the Korean War, it's all to some degree based on money and influence on like economy.
No, it's stopping the ideology of communism, Pat.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fair and all that shit. Yeah, all right.
Says the person who's never looked into any of it.
Yeah. No, but that's what's so interesting, and like that's one of the reasons I wanted to cover World War II, and this is perfect, like talking about World War I in this regard, because it's like, because I one of the things that I like talking about in history is how we got here. What fascinates me about history more than anything is all the things that happened back then that put us to this spot in 2021. So like to me, World War I and World War II are two of the biggest lessons in what war no longer is. Where like World War I, it was no longer about honor, tradition, flying your flag's colors, basically being a sport. You know what I mean? Like to some fucking degree. That died in World War I. And what died in World War II was the idea that like basically, my ideology is better than yours and I'm going to keep spreading it. Like there's very few of that now with like basically religious extremists, but those are everywhere and so much smaller than an organized army. Like, not to dismiss things like the Taliban or Al Qaeda. I'm not trying to talk about that anyway. But like, it's just a like again, people very rarely go to large scale country versus country wars. That doesn't happen anymore.
No,
like,
that's kind of what I was talking about by like the modern war changing things. Like, there's not this many casualties anymore because it doesn't happen like this. Yeah.
Which is good.
Yeah, it's just done differently. I mean, yeah, it's always still horrible. Things like drones are horrible, but like at least it's not 5,000 men charging forward and getting butchered. You know?
Literally getting exploded in an artillery shell instantaneously.
Just imagine how many people 5,000 people are. Just think about that in a room for a moment. 5,000 ghosts.
5,000 people is the generally the size and population of my hometown of Raleigh, Massachusetts. It might be 6,000 now, but like it was around 5,000 people. So every time that number 5,000 is said, and it's in reference, I just picture my entire hometown.
Yeah,
like,
and like,
it's like, oh, okay.
And like people talk about casualty numbers of World War II a lot, not including Holocaust, I'm talking about combat.
Right.
World War II casualty numbers, it's like, like Japan, for example, it's like 1.18 million people. At the Battle of Verdun alone, it was 500,000 dead.
Yeah.
That's one battle of many horrific battles of World War I. World War I is a lot of countries still, Romania is actually an example, have not recovered. They never got back on their feet. And it didn't help that another world war came like 20 years later and just started kicked everyone back down. All the little people got kicked right back down.
Yeah, as was everybody that's like probably the worst part about World War I is what it did to the other countries. I mean, like all you really hear about in news is like France, Germany, England. You don't really hear anything coming from Greece, Lithuania, like what other small Poland. Like,
I mean, Italy is one that's also not talked about a lot, and they were a major part in the First World War because they changed sides.
Right. Yeah, yes, they did.
They started off Central Powers and turned ally. Like it was crazy.
Well, I mean, Hitler was kind of a dumbass for trusting Italy in the first place. But.
Yeah. Also, just for anyone wondering, I don't think Hitler was not involved in Verdun, but Hitler was a soldier who was in World War I. He was a messenger. Yes. He was a corporal, a low-ranking soldier who was a messenger. He was a horse messenger. He got shot in the ass and lied about being too wounded to get back into battle, so he never got back into battle. But medically,
I can't blame him for not wanting to fight, but at the same time, it's just
but just showing your great patriotism, right, for being everything he said.
I mean, a lot of truth came out about him after.
Yeah, of course, and I mean, the world's completely different,
Yeah.
Also, MJ said, "Get on Hearts of Iron 4 and get the USA to join Germany." So I want to bring up something in the game people love. There's a game called Hearts of Iron 4 that I love, and it has a mod called Kaiserreich. And Kaiserreich is probably the most played mod of the game. I think it has a book. There's actually a book out now just about this mod.
Oh my.
I think there's even talks about a television show being made on Amazon about this mod of Hearts of Iron 4. And what this mod is it is super, super well written by this team of historians if Germany won the First World War. And it starts in 1936 and just talks about the world going. It's a crazy story. But even in that reality, America joined the Allies. They just lost.
Right.
I would love to see an alternate history where America did join the Central Powers, because I think it's just kind of a looked over thing that we don't talk about. No one remembers how close we were. We were so close to joining the other side.
One thing that I sarcastically take pride in for this country is that we will ignore vehemently the mistakes we almost made, but didn't. like Cuba, like things with China, like things with Germany. Look at all these mistakes we didn't make.
Yeah,
and we'll ignore them until we're dead.
And it's just like things talking about, like in Kaiserreich, a great example is it doesn't end up well for Germany. It's terrible. After the First World War, they have too much land, they can't control it. There's too many cultures like France underneath their banner that don't get together. Austria-Hungary is in even worse condition than it was before the war. Austria-Hungary is one of my favorite topics of the entire war because they are just a wild story of three cultures that do not get along and do not understand each other, being forced under one banner and not speaking the same language. And they're just a shit show. There's a famous story that when they first started attacking the Serbians, they started losing their battles. This massive nation that once was known as the Holy Roman Empire was losing to this country that's the size of Rhode Island because they didn't know what hand grenades were.
Oh, well, that'll do it.
They were so behind on every time, like worse than the French were.
Jesus.
But that's another episode. That's all I have for Verdun today.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
That's the story.
Maybe I should definitely dive into World War II and talk about like the.
I
might knowing me because I'm a politics guy. That'll probably might be the central theme of it all. Like, but
I like how happy people are not happy. How active the chat was tonight and people coming in and out, which is good to see. That makes me feel like people might want to see more of these crazy war stories. So I might do more of these specific war stories. I am much more knowledgeable in the First World War than the Second as far as battles go.
Right.
So
my obsession with World War II battles was always in D-Day and Battle of the Bulge primarily. Because, like, Africa was cool, too.
Yeah, I mean, El Alamein is actually probably one of my favorite things to look into. Right. Gallipoli for World War One.
Right,
yep. Fuck me, that'll be a good episode. Gallipoli, the Somme.
Yeah. People already know about it, but I definitely want to do a D-Day episode, particularly, like, I mean, I could just tell everybody to watch the first 15 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, but, like,
yeah.
by the way, according to, like, a lot of historians, they were like, that's it, that was it. like if you watch that minute, like, the first 15 minutes of that movie, if you want to know what D-Day was like, it's just like that. No, that was it. Like, that was a very good job.
For me, it was kind of like, for World War One, it was when I was a kid, I saw All Quiet on the Eastern Front. All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah,
and when I saw that movie, I was like, damn, like this is, which is Verdun, by the way. Yeah. And it was just like, damn, like what a fucking crazy time. And like, it's from the German point of view, which I thought was so fascinating that there's a movie from the other side.
Yeah.
Because we never get that.
No, we never do. Yeah. No, I definitely, I've actually, when I was in like, I was one of those like white kids from Massachusetts who was obsessed with World War II.
Mm-hmm. As you do, yeah.
There's a huge group of us. We're not just from Massachusetts, but like, well, the idea, because when you're young, you know, you get told the idealistic story first, which is like it was very much good versus evil, which I will get into, and that is actually a huge part of World War II, is the ideologies of good versus evil, which are totally made up, by the way. Good and evil are ideas.
No, I am the light.
Yeah, but you know, they are not real. Those things are ideas. But however, it was like the last time. You know, I might even call it like the last good versus evil or some shit. You know what I mean?
Right.
The last altruistic war, because it really was. But like,
well, I'm gonna go ahead and say we were fighting evil. The people might not have been like the soldiers.
Yes, because that's.
But we were fighting something pretty fucking evil.
Yeah.
You can feel good about American victory in World War II as an American.
Oh, I do.
100%.
I do. I will. Yeah, I mean, like, good lord. But that's something I wanted to talk about as well, and like, is like what the troop life was like.
Yeah.
Because kind of you kind of briefly talked about it in this one as well. Like the German troops eventually looked at each other and wove like they waved the white flag because they're like, hey, this is terrible. We're done now. Like,
yeah, they would rather be a prisoner than be in these trenches, which says a lot.
Because when you're not getting bombed in a prison cell.
Yeah. For sure.
It's a pretty reasonable trade-off.
Well, I think it's time to wrap this up right now. We're going to go ahead and put the post show up. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in tonight and listening. And if you're listening at home, thank you so much for doing that, or at work or whatever. Thank you so much for the support. We will be back next week with an episode from Pat. We might just got a little preview of what it'll be.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the thematicness. It just feels appropriate. I hope I didn't just ruin my space bar. I just accidentally knocked my mug over on my keyboard.
Oh, don't do that.
Yeah, hopefully. I still have a space bar.
And after his episode, I won't be doing. I want to do another World War One. I'll be working on it for sure in the background. But I have another spooky one I'm gonna do. So.
Oh, nice. And I have, by the way, for those who want some fiction stuff, don't worry. I have a few fictions on the horizon, too. There's a video game franchise that I've played. I'll give you a hint. It's the only video game franchise I ever perfected on Xbox Live. I want to talk about those wonderful games.
Halo?
No.
Oh. Okay.
I like Halo.
I'm John Halo.
I'm John. I like the Halo lore. The Halo lore is pretty good. I'll talk about that. But no, that's not the Halo lore. Though you're in the right realm of genre, that's for sure. But definitely want to get into that.
Next week we'll be with Pat.
Fable. Yes.
Everybody, Pat will start streaming soon after this. We're gonna be rating into him. Thanks for tuning in. If listening, if we're still doing this, twitch.tv/Atlas669. That's me right now. Twitch.tv/Pat Weston. That's Pat over there.
That's me.
The other guy.
The other guy.
Everyone, thank you so much.
Yeah. See you next time, guys.